tasked me with doing a 20-minute talk on basically how marketers can save the world. No big deal. How can brands address the 17 SDGs? You know, small little things like ending poverty, gender equality, you know, no big deal. So as Will said, it is a little bit overwhelming if you look at the SDGs. It is a tiny bit overwhelming, but the big point is that they are all interlinked. It's not like you tick off world poverty and then you tick off hunger. You have to view them all holistically. And I have a sort of secret weapon that will give you a way into the SDGs that will make them a bit more manageable. Now, you might be wondering whether that is something exciting like the metaverse, like NFTs, crypto. It's actually diversity. Oh, well, you know, I'm so glad to see some enthusiasm because if I'm being honest, I talk about DEI at a lot of companies, and sometimes when you bring it up, you see people's hearts sink a little bit. Because, you know, people are like, DEI is not always the sexiest subject. People think, oh my God, I'm going to get a lecture, going to have to sit through slides like this with people of all races holding hands, multicultural hands in the air, people holding the world. You know, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we often do so in a sort of unimaginative kind of way. And that's because, to be honest, a lot of people don't really want to be talking about DEI. They'd rather be talking about things like NFTs, the metaverse. But people know that it is something that they do have to address. I mean, every single company has basically suffered an embarrassing lawsuit in recent years. And during recent years, it's become more top of mind with Black Lives Matter movement going global and protests for racial equality and against police brutality across the world. And there's it's not surprising that it's become top of mind because when you look at demographics are shifting. If you look at, so this chart is from the US, but you know, if you look at the UK and parts of Europe, it's a similar sort of trajectory where you saw boomers largely white, then you look at millennials, a much larger generation, a lot more mixed, and you look at Gen Z, then there's even more mixed. So basically, the world is changing, the face of our cities is changing. But what's not changing is the face of power. And people sitting around the boardrooms, all the decision makers, that's still not really changing. We still face a lot of institutional sexism. So this study was from quite a few years ago. They found that there were more men called John leading major companies than women leading major companies. That's changed now. I think is Mark in some countries. So some progress being made in some areas. And, you know, we still face institutional racism. So this study, again, is from the US, but there are similar studies in lots of different places. And this particular study found that you are twice as likely to get called back for an interview if you have a traditionally white name versus if you have a traditionally African-American name. So the fact that we still, the fact that we've been talking about diversity and, you know, there's still glacial pace of progress is really frustrating because there's so many studies that show that diversity, it makes, you know, it's not just political correctness, it makes good business sense. You know, McKinsey did a big study finding that if you have gender balanced teams, you do better. If you have more racially balanced teams, you do better. And that makes sense, right? Because you're tapping into a broader range of experiences. You're tapping into more talent rather than just a homogenous sliver of society. And there have been studies that found that more diverse leadership teams lead to more innovation. And there have also been studies that show that more diverse teams, and there's a link basically between more gender-diverse boardrooms and an increased level of carbon disclosure reporting. So although there's still not so many studies on how DEI affects sustainability, like there is a positive correlation. We all know that DEI is important. We've been talking and talking and talking about it for years and years, but we still really haven't made that much progress. So how do we go from talking about DEI to talking to actually making it happen? So this is something I've been thinking about for a very long time. And a few years ago, I actually had this light bulb moment. I kind of came up with this brilliant solution to solve this issue for once and for all. So I got a team together, and we basically spent quite a few months just locked away working on this new idea, this new startup that was just going to completely change the landscape, revolutionize the way we talk about DEI. It's called RentAMinority. Basically like an Uber for diversity. So if you put on a conference like this and you realize, oh, all your speakers are white men, you're like, sure, I'm going to get yelled at on Twitter, you can quickly pull up the app, find a minority. And how does this work? Well, minorities out there might be happy to know that you can finally monetize your minorityness. You can sign up online, and a proprietary algorithm will figure out just how diverse you are, just how much you're worth. And some of our featured minorities are here. We've really got a very wide selection. Cheerful woman of color, intellectual black guy, smiling Muslim woman, certified not to support ISIS or your money back. And we have some very, very happy clients. We've got a long testimonial section you can check out on the website, www.rentaminority.com. And we are growing, so we've got some more funding, and we'll be setting a big ad campaign in New York soon. So some of you might be confused, might be wondering, is this for real? Is this a joke? And people ask me this question a lot. So I actually put up a section on the website addressing this, and the answer is yes. It is a joke. It is a satire on basically how a lot of companies approach DEI. And you know what? So I set this website up a few years ago, and the scary thing is, I got like 1,000 applications in the first week, and some genuine business inquiries. Like, I could have made some decent money out of this if I had taken it seriously. And the reason that a lot of people thought this was real, weren't really sure if it was a joke, is because, again, as I said, this is how a lot of companies approach DEI. They're not genuinely enthusiastic about it. I'm sure everyone here is an exception, but a lot of people they really aren't. They don't see it as something that is a business imperative. And so rather than seeing it as something that will help their business, will help them tackle things like the SDGs, they see it more as a defense mechanism, something that they have to address so they don't get lawsuits, so they don't get sued, so they don't get bad press. And that attitude has resulted in a sort of really ineffective approach to diversity. A lot of the things, so there's this Harvard Business Review study that found that a lot of the traditional approaches to DEI are not actually just ineffective, they are counterproductive. People often respond to these kind of compulsory diversity trainings with anger and resistance and more animosity towards other groups. So it's amazing how many straight white men will think that they are actually the victims now because of these diversity initiatives, and how it has actually increased tension in a lot of companies. And this is something I've had quite a lot of personal experience with, because, I mean, I don't want to boast or anything, but in technical terms, I'm a threefer. So I'm brown, female, I'm gay, I'm 3 minorities for the price of 1. And it is amazing how many people seem to think that this gives me this is like a golden ticket to the top, and that ticking more diversity boxes is great for your career. It really isn't. You still have to work twice as hard. And every time you do notch up a success, people are very quick to say, oh yeah, probably a diversity hire, probably because you're a woman. So you're sort of in this lose-lose situation where you have to work harder. But again, people are quick to dismiss your successes because they think, oh, diversity initiatives. This is very, very frustrating. So, RentAMinority was a joke solution to a very real problem. What is the real solution? So, as I said, I only had 20 minutes, so I can't go through everything. But the one message I really want to leave you with today is to reframe DEI. I mean, if if you work in marketing, you understand, like, you know, how important a narrative around something is, and how, you know, how important it is, like, to frame something in the right way. And right now, I do feel like there is a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of real interest in this idea that DEI is a business imperative. And so, I mean, if you Google diversity, these are the kind of images that come up. It's not, it doesn't scream business, does it? It doesn't, you know, it's sort of more kumbaya, sort of, it looks very juvenile. And I think it's really important that we start thinking about DEI, that we start talking about it in the same way that we started talking about digital transformation, 15 years ago. Everybody knew that the world was getting more digital, that if you didn't embrace digital technology, then you're going to get left behind. And it's the same with DEI, that if you don't embrace the fact that the world is changing, that you have to be listening to a wider range of voices, then you are going to get left behind. And it is really important that DEI isn't just, you know, given to HR to deal with. It is everyone's job. It impacts every part of business. And we are seeing that now in the world of tech. We're seeing what happens when you have a small sliver of people, when you get one worldview creating technology. We've seen what happens when you get bias going into the technology, when you have people who weren't thinking, hang on, that data set that I'm training my algorithms on, what's it composed of? Does it really reflect the world? How many biases are kind of programmed into it? And that's why you get things like this. So I don't know if you remember a few years ago, Amazon put together this AI program to screen resumes, and they found that it actually discriminated against any use of the word woman. If there was like women's chess club in your resume, it put it to the bottom of the pile because it thought woman was a bad word. And, you know, I have to think, well, if there had been some more women in the team who worked on that, maybe they might have flagged that. Maybe they might have spoken up about that in the boardroom. This is the sort of thing that happens when you don't have a diverse range of people working on the technologies that affect us all. And, you know, we're seeing more and more of this. And if you're from England to the UK, then you're very familiar with the big A-level scandal from a couple of years ago when algorithms were introduced to grade people's A-levels, and they found that they discriminated against people from lower incomes. And again, that is that is something that happened because they were talking to a small sliver of society who weren't raising the question, who weren't thinking about that, because they only had their very narrow worldview. If we want to create technology that serves us all, we have to listen to a wider variety of voices. And it's the same with the climate crisis. So there's this, I don't know if you're familiar with this, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She's this marine biologist, and she does a lot of work in climate crisis. She wrote this book, edited this book, All We Can Save, about the climate crisis. And a couple of years ago, she wrote this viral essay for the Washington Post, which was about, it was sparked by the George Floyd protests, and it was about how she had to put down her work in the climate crisis to focus on this other crisis, and how basically we need to tackle racism if we're going to tackle the climate crisis. They're not separate problems, they're interlinked. And if you look at, so this is a bit of a wordy slide, but it's worth, she kind of sets out that right now, you know, if you look at the work in the climate crisis, there's still a lot of white male faces. And the funny thing is that the minorities and women are actually more concerned about the climate crisis because, as I sort of shown in the other slides, it affects women and marginalized communities more than it does other people. So you've got all of these people who are like enthusiastic about fighting the climate crisis, who are too busy doing other things, fighting for their lives, fighting against police brutality. You're not tapping into that energy. You're not tapping into that brain power and that experience. And so if you're not doing that, again, you're fighting this massive problem with only just a small sliver of society, only a small sliver of experiences. So there's this, and kind of building on that and taking a step back, there's this phenomenon in the field of risk perception called the white male effect. Technically, it's really the conservative white male effect, and a white male came up with it, so I'm not slandering you. And so this is from 1996 when the phenomenon was first coined, and they found that white men, a subsection of conservative white men, they didn't really see risk in a lot of things that people saw risk in. They were far less risk averse. And although that's changed in a lot of, to some degree, so I've got my book out there, and for my book I did some original research in this, so I was looking at whether this white male effect still exists in climate, when it comes to climate change. And it does. Like, if you look at people, so this is from Global Web Index, asking people, do you think climate change will impact your lives in the next 30 years? And 20% of white men said no, and only 4% of black women said no. You still have a subsection of white men who think that they're going to be fine, and that's because they are going to be fine. They'll have the money to move away, from coastal areas. They'll have the money to be fine. Climate crisis doesn't, it doesn't affect all of us the same. 80% of people displaced by the climate crisis are women. It disproportionately affects women and marginalized people. And those people who have the most skin in the game, who have the most to lose, who have the most sort of on-the-ground experiences with it, and who have so much to give in terms of expertise, in terms of solutions, they're not really listened to. And they're certainly not funded. If you look at funding for green tech, it all largely goes to white men. So we're not funding people who have the experience, whose lives are directly affected by the climate crisis. So even though it makes so much sense that we have to be tapping into these people, there's still dominant train of thought that, oh, okay, the tech guys will save us. Bill Gates went on to CBS or CNN last year and said, to solve the climate crisis, we need 100 Elon Musks. And there is this idea that we just need guys like Elon Musk to come up with technology that will save us all. And that cannot be more wrong. We cannot rely on one type of person to save us. We certainly cannot rely on one person to save us. Basically, the climate crisis affects us all, and it needs all of our brainpower, it needs all of our energy. And if we're only tapping into a small sliver of society, then it's not a good outlook for any of us. As Will was saying, this is a mesmerizing slide, that it is a massive problem, but it's important not to sort of sit back and get overwhelmed by it and think, okay, I'm just going to wait for Elon Musk to fund some newfangled startup that's going to shoot stuff at the moon and we'll all be saved. It's important that we all take responsibility, and there's little things that all of us could be doing. So again, micro actions lead to macro changes, and really we cannot delegate this responsibility away. Every single one of us is responsible. Thank you.